You're live.
I am live. Has anybody joined besides you?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe some others will show up here in a bit.
But
But we are recording? Okay, good. No, you just stare right there and eat your pizza. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ruth Babisett. I work for cPanel as integration developer. Still a department of one. For those of you who don't work for cPanel, we are hiring. I would love to not be a department of two. See me afterwards. There, I've plugged it. Now I can move on. Prior to working at cPanel, I worked for most of 20 years in the library automation business, both working with libraries directly, working for groups of libraries, and also working for the vendors that supply library automation systems. My most recent job was a migration specialist for a company called Bywater Solutions out of California. It was a really cool work-from-home position. Working in your pajamas is really great. However, a work-from-home position for a California company really sucks because you can't get insurance. Quirks of California law. But it was neat because I got to work with libraries. The nice thing about working with libraries is the operational tempo is really slow. There is no life and death in libraries. Don't tell the circulation managers I said that, because they think it is. But it's just books, right? It's books and CDs and DVDs. There's no life and death. There's no patient on the table. There's no warfighter writing on this. So I liked the operational tempo of libraries, and that's why I did it for such a long time. Let's talk a little about library automation generally. The business is $2 billion a year in the United States. That's just for support. Virtually every big-ish library, and by big-ish, it can be pretty small. Most libraries have already gotten some kind of automation. Most libraries are no longer using the little card in the back pocket thing. That's pretty much school and church libraries are the only ones that are still doing it. Some little tiny county libraries in places like in West Texas, but basically everybody that's going to automate in some way has. So the business is mostly swiping customers among each other. And it's like, oh, we put out a new version, it's got these great features, and you want to come to it. So they do. The storage and transmission and indexing methods and features are very inconsistent between the different vendors. Depends on what OS they're based on, depends on what kind of database backend they're using, depends on how old it is. There's a system that dates from '79 that's still huge, and it uses some really hateful old mechanisms. They're trying to introduce Oracle, and they consider that an improvement. Migrations are really painful, and they're usually done by the vendor you're going to or by a third party, a consultant. And they tend to be very lossy. Lots of librarians have complained and complained and complained because every time they migrate, they lose data. And librarians do not like losing data. They get very fussy about that. They don't like losing information, and the newer it is, the less they like that. Now, if it's 10-year-old circulation records for things that they've long since done with, they can usually be talked into it. But newer data, they don't like losing it. But these migrations have been very traumatic, so libraries tend to not do it for several years. They'll stay with a system for 6, 8, 10 years and then migrate to something else. So my job was to migrate from a variety of legacy systems to Koha, which is an open source system. It's first developed in New Zealand as a solution to the Y2K problem. There was a system in use in the Pacific Rim at that time that actually would break on January 1st of 2000. And so this web services company was contracted. They knew nothing about libraries to design this ILS, and they did. And they later sold the intellectual property to another company who now maintains it. And the original library trust that funded it in the first place, that did that initial work. Somebody got a rubber band? Yeah. My job was to migrate these libraries, and Catapo was still around as a trust that funded community development, and that there still are. A little bit about the kinds of data we spotted in libraries.
But it is the most extended echo. It's probably like a minute or two.
It's like a minute behind. Yeah, it's amazing. All right. For every title that a library holds one or more copies of, they usually had a bibliographic descriptive record. Those are usually in a format called MARC that I'll talk about in a minute because it is one of the landmarks of the industry and one of the biggest problems. At the same time, they had item inventory records for the individual barcoded items that they have. Usually some patron biographic and demographic data, their addresses, how old they are, what category of borrower they are, and that sort of thing. Borrowing records, both past and present. Fines and fees. Have you turned in a book late? Did you pay that? If you didn't, they want to keep that, obviously. If you'd already paid it off, I usually try to talk them into discarding that data. You don't really need to keep that beyond about a year because you're going to roll that up in your library's books at the end of the year. That's enough to satisfy the accountants. You really don't need to keep it all the time. Requests and holds, that's where you have told the library, I want to borrow this the next time it's available. You can do that at most public libraries, certainly. Late for class, sit down. Nope, you've got to get people. No. Acquisitions records, that's the records of their budget and purchasing of new materials. And occasionally, and this was a tricky one, serial publication information was where they keep track of a magazine or newspaper, which issues they have received. Now, if you have subscribed to the Chronicle or whatever, and you don't get your issue on Monday, you can call them and they will possibly, maybe eventually have one thrown on your doorstep at some point. Libraries have a little more automated process, a little more streamlined process, just because they have lots of subscriptions. And they usually have a clearinghouse vendor that lots of libraries deal with for magazines in particular. So that information, a lot of the ILSs on the market do not do that well, so they still use paper cards for that. Yeah, shutter because it's painful. They still use, and the cards are kind of a standardized format, and there's one vendor that really makes them, and they're called Cardex, and there's still libraries that use Cardexes. Let's talk about MARC a little bit. MARC was developed in the 70s, about 1972, by the Library of Congress. It's made for 9-track tape. So the first 5 bytes of the record are its length. The first 5 bytes of the record indicate its length. Following that is a directory of tags and subtags that are contained within the record. Once you've eaten up those, however many is indicated by those first 5 bytes, the very next byte is the first byte of the next record. There was no fence post between the records. Wow. Those 5 bytes were the fence post. If you wanted to read the second or third record on a tape, you'd have to read the first 5 bytes and know how many to skip, and read the next 5 bytes and know how many to skip. And yeah, painful, painful. The maximum size of these records, because you only have 5 bytes, and it's not 5 bytes in a long int, it's 5 digits, 100,000 bytes. But realize that the directory information soaks up some of that. And those 5 bytes. They're gone too. And in these days, we also have to worry about Unicode because many Unicode characters take up 2 bytes. So you can have a fairly short bibliographic record and run out of space. One thing that happens pretty regularly, if you have a 3 CD set of the greatest hits of Engelbert Humperdinck, I can't imagine that filling 3 discs, and you wanted to put a note in there that had all the titles of the songs, you can eat up a lot of space that way real fast. But that's the only way to make that searchable, is to get it in that record. Because most ILSs only search what's in here. Some systems even also have inventory data for the actual barcoded item embedded in there. And that takes up space, especially if you have a lot of copies, as schools tend to do. K-12s tend to get a whole lot of copies of things. The format has evolved a little bit. Let's take a look at a record. 000 up there at the top left, that indicates the leader. This record is 1,355 bytes long. C is the command to create a record. AM is its type of bibliographic level, and that indicates a book. Then those two characters could be something else, and it might indicate a map or a serial production or a moon rock or some other realia, some three-dimensional object. There's some encoded fields at the top, the 001, 005, 008. 008 is a byte-positioned encoded piece. 890309 indicates that this record was created in 1989 on March 9th. T tells you that the date that follows that is the copyright date from inside the book. 1876. 1875 is when they actually got it. CTUA means it was produced in Connecticut of the United States. Ing, the language. By the way, the Library of Congress has standardized all the codes like CTUA, there's TXUA, and the languages. Language TLH. Anyone going to guess? Come on, how nerdy are you guys? TLH. Klingon. Klingon. TLH. Klingon is actually a valid language code in the MARC standard. And it's listed, Klingon, artificial language. They had to add it during the Next Gen era because that's when the Klingon Language Institute started putting out books. Right? After that, we have some control information. This indicates the Library of Congress's control record number. Here's the call number in Library of Congress form and the Dewey number right after it. 813.4. The next field is a 100. That indicates that the author is a person as opposed to a corporation or a convention. If you have the minutes of a meeting, that would be a 111. Or the proceedings of a conference, that's a 111. 100 would be a report by the RAND Corporation, and we don't have the author's name. 100 indicates a name. Mark Twain. D, the dates associated with that person. The dates of birth and death. Now, the titles. Twice. 245 indicates the title that is on the title page of the book on the inside. 240 is the title that's on the outside cover.
What's 14?
14? The first character of that means I actually saw this. I'm not getting this from a third party. I actually handled the object. The 4 is a non-filing indicator that says the first 4 characters are to be skipped when you sort. You skip the V, right? Well, we think that's easy because we're used to you don't sort A, N, or D, right? Do you know what doesn't sort in French? I don't, and I've done this for 20 years. Yeah. All of those, those all don't sort. But they would put 2 or 3, whatever is relevant here, and systems just take care of that. And especially if you have a multilingual catalog, that gets really useful. They had to monkey with the standards when they figured out what if those first 3 characters are Unicode, they got 2 bytes each. What do you mean there? Do you mean skip bytes or skip characters? And they had to standardize that because some implementations were doing it one way and some were doing it another way. Yeah, 240 is out here on the spine. And 245 is inside. 260, an indication of where it was produced, the company, when, where. 300, its physical extent, 102 pages, it has illustrations. It's 23 centimeters along the spine. 500 is for notes. And here the Library of Congress, DLC, that's their code, is talking about their copy. And then the 600s are subjects. What is this book about? And these are controlled values. The Library of Congress defines all of those controlled values. They have people who do nothing else. It's right across the street from the Capitol. You expect sanity? What?
So it looks like the numbers are not necessarily in order.
They are not. In fact, in the 6XX series, other than 655, you list them in the order of their importance to the work. What is this book primarily about? It's about a fictional character named Tom Sawyer. If this character had had adventures other than in the Mississippi River Valley, you might list the 651 of wherever else he'd had it as a secondary subject. But they're fussy about that. Now, from this, you might divine and you might think that librarianship is a good use of a mental disorder.
Yes.
You would be correct. Obsessive compulsive people make fantastic catalogers. And they will readily admit this. They will spend hours on one of these. I knew a librarian had a special collection. It was a donated collection from a wealthy patron of the university. She spent 3 years cataloging 1,400 items by hand, writing all this stuff.
Did you read all the books?
No, you don't have to. She downloaded some of these records where there was a copy from somebody else. There are bibliographic services where they share these things back and forth with each other. But she touched and manipulated every one of them. And when that library migrated to another system, those 1,400 records came over without error. And I made fun of her for years after that for exactly that reason. Because everybody else had a few hundred errors to pick off. Hers, no, not a one. The problem with Mark is it's useful for things. Things you can lay your hand on. A book, a DVD, a VCR tape, a Scary-Optin card. You know what those are? Okay, they used to have these photograph things, and you had this little spectacle thing, and it was 2 photographs, and it looked a little 3D when you peered through it. It's good for things. Not so good for internet resources. Not so much. There's actually a mechanism for dealing with an internet resource in there, but as we all know, internet resources do not remain where you put them. They move, and then the library record becomes pointless because you don't have a URL anymore. There's a place in the URL, in the MARC record, in 856, subfield U, you put the URL, subfield Z, you put a text note, and that's the text of your link. The hard limit to the record size, that has largely been overcome by using MARC XML, which is a variant of MARC defined also by the, yeah, but it's XML, so, you know, it's wordy as hell. It's huge, but you don't have that 100,000 character limit. There's no leader or anything else. It's all contained in the tag structure. It is complicated and arcane, and I say that partly because it's also conflated with the encoding. Back up a little. MARC was designed as a transmission format, but it's the only transmission format in use at the Library of Congress and most of the other bibliographic vendors. And librarians now have almost 40 years of experience of saying that a personal author goes in 100 and a title goes in 245 and the subjects go in 6XX. You've conflated the coding where things go in the record with the transmission format. Used to be on the old cards, remember the card catalog? If it was a title card, the title came first, and then the author, and then below that other stuff. And the call number was in the top left corner. If it was a subject card, and so on. And that was an agreed upon thing among librarians. But if your library wanted to use 3x5 cards, and your library wanted to use 4x6 cards, and do large type and use different fonts, it's your own business. The transmission format was not part of the encoding. Here it is. And that means it's deeply entrenched with librarians. And you go monkeying with their records and they get pissy real fast. Real fast. Nonetheless, among younger librarians, there is a Mark must die movement. They're in favor of much more deeply linked data. Data linked in such a way that if you were looking at Interview with the Vampire, you could, in a couple of clicks, go and find other books written by authors who live in New Orleans, like Anne Rice says. That kind of deep linking is just not possible with Mark, not easily. You have to have some external source for all of that. There's a movement toward deeper linking. The problem is, as long as the bibliographic vendors and Library of Congress use it, it's the 900-pound gorilla in the room. It's like saying Microsoft must die. You can wish for it all day long. You can design all kinds of great things that aren't Microsoft, but it's not going to die on its own.
What about international?
Internationally, there are, the transmission format is ISO 2709. There are variant encodings where the numbers mean different things in other countries. Norway has one. Most of Europe has standardized now on one that is called Unimark, that is much more Unicode friendly than this. And the idea was in Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, the Benelux countries, and Italy, they wanted a common interchange format, and so the national libraries of all those countries got together and said, well, let's make an ISO 2709 format that we can all agree on. And Unimark was a result of that, and that's now kind of global. And Koha can work with either Mark 21, which is the United States version, or Unimark. But it can't work with Normark from Norway. It can't work from, what do they call it? Germany's version of the Mark record is structured a little differently. Yeah.
Deutschmark?
I know. That was on my lips. I wanted to say Deutschmark, but I know that's not it. No. So my job would be to get a hold of a library that had, this is a typical kind of a small town public library. They might have 2 or sometimes 3 branches for this many records. 100,000 marks, 120,000 items, more or less. 10, 12,000 patrons was pretty typical. 4,000 current and overdue items out. 6 to 10,000 fine and fee records. More and more libraries are doing away with overdue fines because they figured out they can't collect enough to pay for the person that collects them. So they've just stopped. Unless you lose the book, you don't pay. And 200 or so of these hold requests where I want this copy when it comes in. And we wanted to not lose any of that. That was pretty typical sort of library. I did a lot of libraries that were this scale. How did I run the projects? Now, when I started doing this, I was the 6th person hired by the company, and I was alone. I was the only one doing it. And my mandate from my boss, who I had known for years and years and years before, because everybody in the library business knows each other. Some of us are married to each other. Some of us have slept together. It's a deeply inbred little world. We've all worked for everybody. I've worked for 4 different companies doing this, right? My mandate was make it less painful. Cut out the suffering. I said, okay. So we'd start with a kickoff meeting, and one of the things that I would say, I hear it over and over again in libraries. I don't like change. I don't like change. Well, you don't have to be in libraries to not like change, right? Some of us are kind of change averse. Here's the thing. I would reframe that conversation in that kickoff meeting by saying, look, all of us are used to change. Have you stopped growing older? Have your kids stopped growing older? Weather changes, politics changes, unless you live in Texas. We all deal with change every day of our lives. The problem is not change, the problem is the unknown. When I hear, I don't like change from a librarian, what that means is, most of the time, I don't know how I'm going to do my job after I do this. Eliminate those unknowns, the fear of change goes away. So that was how I kind of framed things. then the library, sometimes I would have to help them. They would extract data from their current system. Sometimes their vendor would help, grudgingly in many cases, because they knew they're about to lose a customer. And they'd throw it in Dropbox. And I told them what I wanted. I'd say, well, your system, if you run this report and drop it in the Dropbox, I can do it. And if you run this extract, it's going to embed the item, so you don't need item reports. It'll embed the item records, and I can use that. And I'd tell them what I wanted. And over time, since there's only about 8 or 10 big systems left, I kind of knew what all the systems were competent to do, and so I could talk them through most anything. Then I peer at the data, and I do my test migration. And this was through a series of command line scripts. And here in a minute, we're going to start looking at that code. But it was a series of command line scripts, and I'd capture those. Manipulate the mark records, manipulate the borrowers, clean up holds, do this, and then, you know. I had all these steps, and I wrote them all in the script. I just kept it on a wiki. We had a DocuWiki, and I just kept it all in there. And that was my script. I'd load it on a test server in our cluster, and I'd tell the library, okay, and they'd start looking at it. They'd find things, sometimes, and they'd tell me about it, and I'd fix them. This was also a good opportunity. They would have codes like location or branch codes, things that are, you know, if you have 10 branches and you have Main and South Side branches, you might have a code of Main and South, Mock for Mockingbird, or, you know, whatever. This was a chance for them to rearrange those codes. It was also a chance if they had multiple item types that actually borrowed the same way, I would recommend merging them. Most libraries are getting rid of VHS tapes. Thank God. But they still usually have some around archival stuff and whatever, and they'll still loan it out until those things wear out. They'll keep loaning them out as long as somebody will borrow them. And I would recommend frequently, do you loan these out the same way you do DVDs? And they'd say, yeah. And I'd say, why don't you just call both of them video? And then in the record, there's a note about what format it actually is. And that'll simplify your circulation rules too, because then you don't have to have 2 different rules for each borrower type. Oh, yeah. And they'd have 10 or 12 different things that don't circulate at all. The maps, the county records, I said, call this reference. And then you need one rule that says don't move it. Oh, that's a great idea. The library looks it over. They configure the system. They would go in and set up their branches and all that stuff. And we also usually sent out trainers. And we also did our training by a webinar, but we tried not to. Only for very poor libraries did we do it by webinar. Most of the time we sent a person. Our habit in that company was to train in person for the aha moment. We wanted to see that tough nut librarian, the cataloger who is absolutely hating this, go, aha. So, and the beauty of this method was they're training on their own data. They know their collection. And a librarian, especially a cataloger, she knows her collection like you know what's in your pocket. Seriously, they know the big stuff. Do not start with me, Wade. Do not start with me. So having them train on their own collection, they knew who the problem borrowers are. They know who the people are that they see every week. They know the toothless tiger, the aging person who comes in to look at genealogy records. They know these people. They know the records. So getting them to train on a copy of their own data was really, really useful. And then for Go Live weekend, and it usually was a weekend, I would leave the configuration data alone in the test server and throw away all the data. They'd re-extract the data after the library closed, put it back in the Dropbox. I'd run through that same script as corrected based on the punch list, give it over to them. Done. Now, if their training was not too far before that Go Live weekend, then that person who was scared of I don't know what I'm going to be doing the day after Go Live doesn't have that problem. And I heard over and over and over again from large and small libraries, this process is the best we've ever seen. They're still doing it. They have 3 people doing it now. Plus they contract me out every now and then for the hard ones. Because it sounds conceited, and it might be, but other people tell me I'm the best in the world at doing this for Koha. I've certainly done more of them than any human being currently living. So, what about that data? One of the things that's really, really useful, libraries give your borrowers and their books a barcode normally, and that barcode is supposed to be unique. Occasionally it's not, but it's supposed to be unique. Most systems will enforce uniqueness on this identifier. That's great. That gives me a handle to hook everything to. I would splice the mark records. If the items were not in the mark record already, they'd be in a CSV file usually, or some sort of Excel-ish thing that I could turn into a CSV, and then I could embed them in the mark record in Koha's format. Other systems, if they embed the item data, do it differently. There is no standard for that. So one system might put it in 999, and one might put it in 949, and I needed it in 952. I'd tidy things up. If you have an item type code box, some systems don't enforce a controlled list. You can type whatever you want to. So to a computer, as you all know, this is not the same as this is not the same as this. Right? I would normalize all of that for them. I'd go looking for crap like this and fix it. There's even a bigger problem in a lot of times in the borrower data, because city is rarely a controlled field and state frequently is not. So one time I did a small college in Tennessee. Great little small town. It was awesome. I loved training those people. They only have 5 full-time employees at this library. The whole university was like 45 employees. They had 1,200 students. I don't know how they did it. But in their borrower records, I saw this. I saw this. I saw this, which us oldie moldies will know about. I saw this, which even older moldies will know about. And I saw this. Say it. I pointed this actually showed up on about a dozen records. And I went to the public services head and I said, "You're never going to believe what I found your borrower records." And she said, "Oh God, give me the list." So I gave her the list. She's like, "Well, I could fix that in the borrower records." I said, "No, I've tracked around that. It'll be automatically fixed in the final data." But she said, "Well, give me the list anyway. I'm curious to know, if there's some common thread there." Turns out one of them was one of her student workers who had deliberately done that as kind of a gag. Easter egging, trolling the system. And I'm like, I've busted. She's like, "Yeah, I've made him think for about a half an hour that he was about to be fired for that." I said, "Oh, no, don't fire him." She said, "No, I won't. He's our best student worker." But I'd made him think he was about to be fired for a little while. All right, so I'd go tidying this kind of thing up, and I had a map file. It was basically a CSV that I would read in at the beginning of a processing run and say, wherever state looks like this, substitute that. Do the same thing for cities, because the post office wants it all in upcase. So I'd upcase everything, and then if you had a town like Corpus Christi, how many ways can you misspell Corpus Christi? Yeah, Corpus Christi was one of our libraries that we did. We did Corpus Christi Public and Corpus Christi Schools. They were on the same system at that time.
And did you do regexes on these in the spreadsheet, or was it just fixed?
I did some regexing, but a lot of it was just fixed. Yeah. Let's see some code.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me drop out of this then and switch over here and get a new window. That's probably way too teeny tiny. I never threw away a piece of code because I was doing this over and over and over again. I never threw away a piece of code. And once it stopped being just me, which was in about June of 2011, I'd been doing it for 7 or 8 months, I made a Git repo and threw it out there so that that other person could also utilize that and also put things in it. She had commit bit so that she could throw things into it as well. Our company was of the position that every piece of code we write until the end of days will be open source. So all of this is released GPL2 or higher. And I had all kinds of stuff. I mean, these are some of the different systems I converted away from. Learning Access ILS and other Koha forks that were out there. Horizon, Dynix Classic, that was painful. Millennium, Sagebrush, some of these others. But over time, I noticed that I had a lot of the same stuff happening. I'm dealing with a mark record, and it either has embedded items, or the items are in a CSV, or a pipe delimited file, or a tab delimited file. So I started a generic directory and started making kind of generic sorts of things that didn't rely on any given system. And more, I just kept piling a bag on. I'd add more stuff. And every time a new need came around, I would just pile more crap into this one piece of code until, you know. So eventually I had, like this little bitty one, it expects an input mark file and a command line parameter of a field to drop. It won't touch a running database. It outputs a revised mark file with all those tags dropped. So if you wanted to drop the 999 tag out of something, one of a node or something in some system that was meaningless, you could run this, give it a mark file, say 999, it would chuck them all out, give you back a mark file. It's really handy. And it would count things, and I kind of had some standards for how I wrote these. And about the time that I started this Git repo, I started reading Perl best practices, which is good and bad. It can make you a little pedantic if you're not careful. But given that I was the most experienced coder at the company at the time, which those of you at cPanel who know me will be frightened by that, because I'm not. I can't hold a match to this guy down here. I can't hold a match to him either. You know, the coders around here make me look like a clueless idiot. But I was the best coder in the shop. So I wrote these kind of Mondrian and pedantic for a reason. And the reason was that somebody not quite as bright as me had to follow behind and be able to make heads or tails of it. So my masterpiece, really, the biggest, coolest piece of code I did was the bibliographic masher, the thing that would take mark records and either embedded items or CSV items and create mark records that were ready to ingest right into Koha. And it would expect a file of mark records and optionally delimited item records, and it would create a mark file. And it had all kinds of parameters. And you could do things like delete this mark tag before you create items, delete this mark tag after you create items, because I'm going to get item data out of that tag. So create items and then delete it. Or one system, the price of the item was returned in pennies. So a $35 item was $3,500. Well, I wanted, anytime I saw that, I wanted to divide it by 100 because Koha expects it in decimal money. Date formats were always a problem. No two systems seemed to be the right way for Koha, and of course Koha uses ISO. And space and a 24-hour time for those things where time was relevant. Some places wanted to prefix their barcodes. They had really old barcodes that were short, and they were joining a consortium, and they were going to rebarcode everything, and they needed a prefix and to make the barcodes longer so there wouldn't be collisions. So I wrote tools in that would do that. If you had an external file of items, you needed to define how to match them with the bib record. Usually that was the ISBN number, the International Standard Book number, which in fact can be duplicated, but it doesn't happen very often, fortunately. All kinds of crazy things I wanted to do this. There's some of the stuff I usually used. The last staff retreat I was at, which was about 2 months before Wade hired me here, I did a class on some of this. And I talked about PvP, and I said, it's your friend. Because if you understand PvP, you'll be able to read my code. How many of you have used Perl Critic? Right. You know that by default it looks for level 5, just the basic obvious stuff, and you can put 4, 3, 2, or 1, which is really gruesome and nobody ever passes it, right? My standard was if you write a piece of code and you want it to be included in this repo, it needs to pass Perl Critic-4. That's going to be basically readable code. 3, there are a few stylistic things in 3 that I don't care. Take your pick. They're both readable. So I chose 4. There is a really fantastic Perl module on CPAN for handling mark record, mark : record, and then there's of course ones for reading batch, where you feed it just a stream of data and it will parse it into a whole bunch of array of objects, array of things.
Andy Lester was the original author on that.
Who?
Really? Andy Lester, Tap Dance.
Yeah.
Wow. He's
the current maintainer is Galen Charlton, who's from Washington. I know him. The command line parameters were kind of extensive. I used get option for that. We just kept bolting stuff onto this. But once you figured out how a Millennium system worked, if you could get the library to extract their data in a consistent way, I mean, I would take the script from another Millennium library and start with that. I'd say, well, you know, this was Brooklyn Law School. Well, they were like so-and-so, so I'll copy their script and use that as a starting point. Change file names, see how it works. Might have to monkey with a few things. But I've converted this kind of library before, this ILS. Integrated Library System.
So were these eventually ending up growing into a MySQL database?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the mark record is actually the mark record is stored twice in the database.
Awesome.
Yeah, once in raw mark format and once in mark XML. God help them. They stored the entire XML. And then the indexing engine could either use the mark or the mark XML. Well, if you had excessively large mark records in there, you wanted to always use the mark XML because the mark would be truncated at some awkward place, and it wouldn't index properly. I allowed for multiple delimiters. One of my other scripts had a couple of other choices as well. And then, you know, here's kind of the basic way for checking for, did you do all the parameters you needed to do? And I might have multiple map files. Like I could map location codes, and I could map branch codes and item types and all this stuff. So the script would read in all those maps, and I just threw them into a hash. They're just hashes. So then as I was processing each record, I'd say, well, if this hash exists, and if there's a value that matches, if there's a key that matches what's in the record, then replace it with the new value. Real brute forcing. Did this a lot. You can tell. You'll see a lot of those. Debug and print dumper stuff. I used dumper a lot while I was picking on these things. I could also do, like, one of the things that comes in pretty regularly is they didn't have price data. So Koha wants a price in the item data so it knows how much to charge a borrower who loses the item. Otherwise, it won't charge them anything. Other systems have a default value that say always charge 60 bucks or whatever. I could do several things. I could assign a default value to everything that didn't have a value. I could look in the mark record in $460p for the price in the bib record, or I could assign based on item type. So all books are this much, and all DVDs are this much, and all reference are that much, and so on. So I could do that kind of assignment too. And then if the items were in an external file, I threw them into a hash. And some of those hashes got pretty big. 200,000 items, yeah. The server that I used for my test server had, at its peak, 20 instances of Koha running, and it was a pretty grunty server. But it wasn't getting a lot of web hits because we might have 3 libraries that are training or testing at any one time. And I'm working on the data for this one, and this one just finished, so we're keeping the test server for a couple of weeks, and this one, so they weren't all terribly active. And for go live, of course, nobody else is working. I'd shut down the web server, and I'd just be cranking data. And so the whole system was kind of dedicated to what I was doing. There was one weekend after we got a second person, she and I both had a migration on the same night. And the fact that mine was a great big library, 500,000 volumes and 300,000 patrons, and it was huge. And we had a little bit of resource contention that night. Things ran a little slow, but we got the job done. You know, these scripts are not as efficient as they could be, not by half. But I could migrate 52 libraries in a year when I was out for a month for surgery. In July of 2011, I took off for a whole month. And they had hired the second person the week before I went in for that surgery. She said of those days, it's like, you know, getting handed a tricycle and being told to run in the Indianapolis 500, which is where I got that from. And I'm sure, because she got thrown into the fire and had 2 migrations while I was out. That I had basically done all the work. I had all the scripting. I had it all set up. All she had to do was execute go live. But I was out for a month, and I did 52 migrations that year. And she did another dozen. Busy, busy.
There's some labels in there.
Yeah.
Those for like go-to.
No, I didn't ever use a go-to. I never use a go-to. One of the, how familiar are you with PVP? Pro Best Practices. Pro Best Practices says that if you're going to use next or last, it should attach to a label.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you'd say last record if. And the only time you use a postfix if in PVP is for flow control.
Oh, okay.
So you don't do an assignment if, you do if. But you can do a postfix if for flow control. And next and last were the only ones I used. PVP suggests don't using unless, because you tend to get double negatives. Unless something not equals 4. Wait, what? It's not readable. So PVP suggests not using unless, and then always having a label for next and last. It does make it nice and easy to read. You can look at that blue.
I'm just getting the noise because of the empty while.
Where?
Oh, at the top, right below right here.
Oh, yeah. Because we...
I see.
Yeah.
It's just giving me the noise.
Yeah. Yeah, when you're reading in Mark out of a batch, you're doing that as if it was a tape. Pull in the record, and then attempt to pull in a record. If you get 0 bytes back, you've hit the end of the file. There is no record, and so that last works just fine. Yeah. Here's where I could set default prices, and I could also tidy up their data if it was sloppy. Could do things like get rid of the $sign if it was there because I didn't want those. And then here's where I ingested the item record into there. And in my match fields where I said this field goes in the barcode field, and this is the item type, and this is, I could also specify a tool for manipulating that data. And that's where I handled weird date formats or that division to get rid of pennies or any other kind of data munging I wanted to do. And that's from that call to underscore manipulate data up there. And I would have a command string in the parameter. I would have a match and say like item sub equals, and then it would be like the source subfield, the target subfield, tilde, and then a tool. What I wanted to do to it. So if that tool was like div:100, it would divide by 100. Or it might be something like date2, which was one of 7 or 8 date formats. And you had to do it 2 ways. One was if they were in a separate file, and another way if they were embedded. Because if they were embedded, you just processed each mark record as you went. If they were in a separate file, you might have some left over. And then I needed to do something with the leftover ones. And you could have multiple matches, multiple items attached to the same copy, which in a tab delimited file or a comma delimited file would be separate records. So you needed to cope with that. Where if they were in the mark record, they just all.
So how long did these strips take to run?
It depended on the library, but for a library of 100,000 bits, 120,000 lines, it would run for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. This one is like nearly 800 lines long. Here's where it will report at the end. And if a mark record was going to blow off the end of the mark, it would convert it to XML and start a separate file. That's mark XML. Because I could ingest those into other. I got my mark record ready. I looked at it, it was too long. It was going to be a correct mark record. So I thought I would just convert it to XML later.
When stores the mark record, just effectively generate
I didn't store the mark. I would create it. I would initialize a mark record object and fill it with all the data and then see how big it was. And if it was bigger than 100,000 bytes, you couldn't write it out in mark format. You had to write it as XML.
I'm going to ask how stores it.
Legacy. 12-year-old code base. Written by people who don't understand libraries. Along the way, I will have captured some branch codes, some item types, authorized value codes for locations and collection codes, and I'd write myself a little SQL script to set those up in the database. Because if I tried to ingest the records, and the record had an item that was in some cell branch, the branch didn't exist, it'd throw the record away. So if you didn't run this, and then ingested your mark records, you had 0 records because it just threw them all away. So I wrote a little SQL script and just had it spit it all out. And then here's that data manipulation thing. I can uppercase everything. That was a pretty fun problem. Uppercase, strip off leading spaces. I could do a conditional on one tool, conditionally do this tool. I could add a suffix to something, I could divide by, and a bunch of different things. So that's the kind of thing I did. I had another one for patrons. I had another one that, like a lot of times in the database, you'd have a patron ID that was just the key for the table. It was just, you know, the auto incremented key, and that's not the barcode. And when they extracted their checkout say, it would have that key and not the barcode. Well, I'd have to go to the patron table and create a map, so I'd know which patron actually had it by a number that was going to mean something in Koha. Basically, I needed to eliminate the tableisms that came from the parent table. So I'd go through and substitute all that data. Same thing for items. It would have like an accession number that was just an auto-incremented table number. That's not the barcode. I wanted the barcode. So that's the kind of stuff I would do with that. And then just copy what command line I'd put together. So then on go live night, because that was a lot of times, you know, 10, 11 o'clock at night, I'm tired and old. And so I just copy and paste, copy and paste, and copy and paste. And just do it. The shortest project we ever had to do this was the public library in Angel Fire, New Mexico. I talked to their director, their only employee, on a Wednesday. He had questions about the migration process, and I said, you know, once you sign the contract, and you know, we have this meeting, and then you'll extract data, and you send data, and that, you know, and then we migrate you on some weekend. We migrated them that Friday night. 14,000 items, and about 300 patrons. Little. Our longest project was 12 and a half months. And that was the Washoe County Library System in Nevada. In the yes. Yes. It's all written in Perl. Now it's Perl that some of you Perl geeks would sneer at. Most of the time. I was the first programmer in the Perl community to go to a YAPC. And then I left the community. It's his fault. Yeah. And, you know, I go to my first YAPC and I left the community. And then, yeah. I asked my boss, I said, do you see anybody else? He's like, hell no. Go hire him. I'm like, no. No, the guy that hired me, that fished me out, is gone. You don't have to worry about him anymore. No, but yeah, I was the first one to go to YAPC, and then I committed. There are some pretty experienced programmers around the world. There are companies all around the world that support this. One in New Zealand, a couple here in the States, several in Europe, and they hold an international con every year. It moves around. This year it was in Reno, hosted by the Washington people that I worked with for so long. And next year it's in Cordoba, Argentina. So I don't think I'm going to get to that one. But I did get to go to India a couple of years ago, and that was super cool. That's the kind of stuff I created. What sort of questions do you have about that? Is there anything? I mean, we've kind of had some as we go along, mostly from Todd trolling me in the back, and Wade trolling me in the back.
Did you ever have to extract data from tape?
No, I never had to extract data from tape. Now, that said, I had some pretty ugly systems that I had to go in and yank data out of. Never did anything that ugly, no. One of the systems was Dynix Classic. And that's a system that quit being sold about 1998. And the company that used to support it had stopped support for it in about 2004, 2005. But the public library that was still using it, they were, shall we say, extremely change averse. So they were running on an unsupported system for eons. And once they finally decided to go to Koha, and we sold them on it, I told them during the kickoff meeting I needed one person who was fairly technically savvy with reports from this system to be my liaison for the data. The person they picked, it'd be like asking Nielsen to perform an appendectomy. You wouldn't want it. You could ask him, but you really wouldn't want it. It was messy. This guy really didn't know what he was doing. He really was not as technically savvy as he thought he was. And he was also against the project. That complicated matters even more. And he really didn't know what it was running. Now, and this system was running on, crap, what was the name of that? I don't even remember the name of the database engine. But it's still pre-SQL 92, ancient. I had plenty of databases that were in MS SQL or God help them Access, where all they knew to do was send me the MDB, LDB files. I'm like, I'm good with that. I have a Swiss Army can opener. LibreOffice. I can crack open all kinds of stuff with LibreOffice. The biggest tool in my kit for cracking things open frequently was LibreOffice, or I had they had a runtime of SQL Server that you could get for free that would let you read only a database, which was perfect for me. I'm like, I want to read it and yank a bunch of data out and throw it into flat files.
I was shocked to see FileMaker up there. Is that a common system?
Koha actually, well, yeah, it came. There was a couple of libraries that used FileMaker, customized FileMaker constructs.
So it wasn't like a standard package. It was everybody wrote their own.
There was a lot of those. There were a lot of, we rolled our own. Some of those were pretty painful. Most libraries now don't do that. But in the early days of library automation in the 80s and early 90s, there weren't any really good players in the market. And you had a lot of university administrative computing departments who said, well, this is an inventory application. We can write this. Which, you know, made the librarians blanch because it's not an inventory application the way they think of it. So you had computer science people who were writing applications that didn't suit the purpose very well, librarians who hated them and wouldn't talk to them frequently, and then you wonder why these systems really didn't work very well. I actually went in to consult with a library one time about something else altogether. They had a brand new director. The ink was still wet on her master's degree. She had just got her master's degree. But this was at a Seventh-day Adventist university. And they only hire members of their faith for certain faculty level positions. This is like a lot of religious colleges. And the head of cataloging had applied for the job 3 times and been turned down 3 times because she was not a people person. She was an awful OCD monster that nobody liked. They'd been without a director for 3 years. So they hire this director with her brand new master's degree. The cataloger hates her because she's got her job. This lady goes over to the University Administrative Computing Department where their ILS server is hosted and says, hi, I'm the new library director. They're like, nobody has talked to us from the library in 4 years. Really? That was interesting. That made for a really interesting consult. I'm like, okay, when we have lunch, I want the IT people sitting here. I want the library people sitting here. I will wear my black and white striped referee's uniform. All right? Let's talk about mission and vision here. You know, got an issue. Libraries are interesting places. They're not just shush. There's a lot of shush, but libraries tend to be populated by well-educated, intelligent, accepting people. Unless you're noisy in the library, then they'll shoot you. But I liked working with them. I liked working with their data. I still do. And I enjoyed learning to code the way I did. Now, that's created a problem for me here at cPanel because they don't code that same way. Dark arts compared to what I was doing. Having to learn all new dark arts. I'm glad you've been here. Thank you. I don't have anything more to say. I've rambled long enough.
Can you show us the Koha system?
Sure. In fact, I think I have one running on one of my servers. Nope. No. I'll show.
Is that your great success?
Yeah, that's how you landed here. Okay.
So is this skinnable?
Yes, it is. Let me blow it up. A lot of it is done through configuration settings in the staff client. Usually what we would do, the staff client would be running on a separate named virtual host. As packaged, it runs on 8080, which I always kind of discourage. I would say just use a named virtual host. And then you could, do SSL on both of them if you wanted to, whatever you need. A lot of library systems, let me pull one up. Montgomery County Public Library. Happen to know what this one's running. I think they're still running it. They have migrated. They were running a system for a while that if you entered it would break and search. If that was your search term, which of course is the title of the Stephen King book, so you might actually want to find Matilda Price, right? And a movie of the same name. But it was a stop word in their search. So you'd get no results. And if you entered to be or not to be, that's all stop words and operators. The or not is an operator, and to be are both stop words, and so it would just give you this message, an error message that's completely meaningless. Right? And so Koha, one of the nice things about Koha, and I used to preach about this, I would say, it, and it works, usually. Yeah, and there it is right there. And there's an ebook copy right there, the third item. Yeah. The fact that this worked, there were no stop words. That was one thing. And also, we plugged a lot. Librarians don't like Google very much.
Is that 2.5 million results?
253,000 results. Yeah, every bib record that has it anywhere in it. But it's weighted, so the title's weighted to the top. Certain fields are more valuable than others, and so they bold to the top, and notes are like at the bottom. But if you put a note within it, it would be in the tip. Librarians don't like Google very much, and they like Wikipedia even less. And so they used to have these arcane search languages where you'd say things like, right? The only people that know that is librarians. It's useless for most of your borrowers. And I had this argument with librarians all the time. I'd say, how many people are on your campus at your university? 7,000. Faculty, staff, students. Right, how many of them are librarians, Ken? How many of them are catalogers? 2. So should we teach the catalog the way the rest of the universe speaks, or do you want to try to teach him the way you speak? Which looks like easier job? You want me to do it, or you want to do it? And they inevitably would say, well, gosh, now that you put it that way. Yeah.
Amazon used to be searchable by that language.
Yeah.
I think you can still do it. If you follow it.
Yeah. If you find the right entry point, you can still do.
So does it support one? So
Does it support that behavior? Yeah. Used to. Yeah. Still does. Not so much. Yeah. So I tell them Koha's search box works more like Google, which most of your patrons are going to want it to work like. You just throw words at it. And it has some relevancy pieces built in that say a title and an author are worth more than a note. The subject heading is somewhere in between. But a term that appears anywhere in there will hit. So, yeah, the search box works pretty well like that. I wish I had thought of it. I'd have my staff client up for my test server. I did have a test server running a while back that could switch language between English and Arabic. One of my latter gigs, right before I left, was to go to Amman, Jordan for 2 weeks and work with libraries there on internationalization. So that's been an area of some interest. They kind of use make text, sort of. What they do is they have a script that extracts the strings from the templates, and then they go out and create profiles for those, and then they use make text to create another copy of the templates with the language changed. Instead of doing it on the fly, like make text kind of wants to do, where you load up all of your translation and you switch locales. No, they didn't do that. They just make another whole set of templates with all the pain and suffering that goes with that. Because you have to remember to update your templates every time you make a string change, and it's pain.
If you drive to your website with a make file, there's no big
I was going to say,
Yeah.
really good make files.
Yeah. But again, remember how awesome their programmers are. I'm one of the better ones, and I don't know how to do a make file. So, yeah, they're just figuring out how to do Debian packaging. Yeah, getting hot around there. All right. Anything else? Thank you.